Portugal, a country where the beautiful warm climate masks a complicated economic situation, and everything is too closely intertwined to be a coincidence. Emigration compensates for the weak labor market. Tourism drives up prices, and small businesses are unable to escape the low value-added trap. About 30% of young Portuguese live abroad. More than 850,000 people who have taken their work, taxes, and future outside the country. Inside, there remains a market with low incomes and limited growth opportunities. Lisbon has turned into a city where housing has become detached from the reality of incomes. The average apartment costs more than 19 years' worth of salaries. It's worse than in global financial centers like New York, London, or San Francisco. Tourist capital and external demand have eaten away at affordability for local citizens. Business structures are declining. 96% of companies in Portugal are micro-enterprises with fewer than 10 employees. Such an economy scales poorly. It hardly invests in productivity and does not generate high wages. It survives, but it doesn't develop. Today we're talking about Portugal, a country that ranks 19th in GDP per capita among EU countries, with a figure of $29,292.2 for 2024. It falls short of the EU average by $14,000 and ranks 9th from the bottom. And that's despite the fact that it wasn't always like this. In 1750, Portugal's GDP per capita exceeded that of France and Spain, and Lisbon was the fourth largest city in Europe. The country was at the top of the continental hierarchy, with global trade routes, colonial revenues, and the status of an imperial center. So how did a country that started out among Europe's leaders slide, over a few centuries, into the role of a chronic outsider surviving on transfers, tourism, and external support? And isn't this story repeating itself, just in a more modern, institutionally disguised form? Portugal began to stand out among other countries on the continent even at the stage of its formation as a state. The Portuguese finished defining their borders back in 1297. And from that moment, Portugal has hardly changed for more than 700 years. The stability is explained by the fact that geographically, the country is located on the western edge of the continent, isolated from the rest of Europe by natural barriers and rivers. The Minho and Guadiana rivers, mountain ranges, and the Atlantic Ocean. Under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, the Portuguese began to explore the African coast and improve maritime technologies, such as light caravels and navigational instruments. These were investments in the future that paid off in full. Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias led the first European expedition to round the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, opening a sea route to Asia through the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama opened the sea route to India by sailing around Africa. His first voyage brought a fantastic return, with a profit 60 times greater than the invested capital. Ukraine managed to establish direct control over the routes from Asia to Europe. The Portuguese broke the centuries-old monopoly of Venetian and Muslim traders on the spice trade, and in 1500 they discovered Brazil. Lisbon became one of the richest ports in the world, competing with both Venice and Antwerp in Belgium. But the wealth turned out to be unstable. In 1580, Portugal was occupied by Spain. This was the result of a dynastic crisis, when the Portuguese crown was left without a legitimate heir, as well as a direct clash of interests between the two empires, which competed for control over maritime trade and colonies. In an era when the state was identified with the dynasty, the weakness of the throne automatically opened the door to external interference. Overall, the large number of wars and conquests in Europe at that time was a systemic feature of the era. Control over territories meant control over taxes, ports, trade routes, and resources. The lack of stable international rules, constant struggle for prestige, and colonial revenues turned wars into an instrument of economic policy. For Portugal, Spanish rule meant the loss of autonomy in decision-making, being drawn into foreign conflicts, and the gradual exhaustion of the economy. Resources were directed toward Spanish wars, and its enemies, the Dutch and the English, began systematically seizing Portuguese colonies. The country lost key trading centers in Asia, Malacca, Hormuz, Formosa, as well as important African outposts on the Gold Coast, including Elmina. After regaining independence from Spanish rule in 1640, the country was too exhausted until the Portuguese discovered gold in Brazil in 1693. At the end of the 17th century, large gold deposits were discovered in the Brazilian province of Minas Gerais. The extraction of the precious metal skyrocketed from less than 20,000 kilograms per year to over 140,000 kilograms in the 1730s. Over 80% of this gold went to Portugal, creating unprecedented revenues for the relatively small European nation, and it accounted for over 70% of Portugal's total exports. Portugal's real effective exchange rate during the 18th century strengthened by about 30%, which directly coincided with the period of peak gold production. The real exchange rate is the ratio of prices for goods and services inside the country and abroad. It shows how many foreign goods you can get in exchange for domestic goods. That is, if earlier, a Portuguese could exchange 10 shirts of his own production for 10 English ones now. For 10 of his own, he will get 7 English ones. After the discovery of the deposits, the Portuguese really did get more gold. But their labor became less valuable on the world market. The productivity of the craftsmen did not change. They produced the same amount of goods in the same amount of time. However, within the country, prices for rent, materials, and workers' wages rose sharply. Portuguese producers were forced to raise the prices of their goods to cover their expenses. At the same time, their competitors in England or France, who did not receive such a golden gift, kept their previous lower prices. As a result, Portuguese goods became too expensive for the world market, and buyers began to choose cheaper foreign alternatives. This led to a collapse in production. By the 1750s, almost all Portuguese factories had ceased operations. Instead, annual imports from England jumped from £355,000 in the period from 1699 to 1702 to £1,300,000, 1756 to 60. In today's equivalent, this is an increase from 71 million to 260 million euros. At the same time, exports collapsed from a peak of 77 million euros in 1720 to 51 million euros in today's terms. That is, there was a sharp imbalance. For the economy of that time, it was not just a trade deficit, but a chronic outflow of resources that was undermining the state's finances from within. By the 1750s, Portugal had an annual deficit of 4 billion reis, the Portuguese currency at that time, which is 320 million euros in today's prices. This amounted to 3.9% of the state's nominal GDP. For comparison, in 1720, the deficit was 2 billion reis, or 160 million euros. The budget gap actually doubled, turning into a systemic financial burden. The deficit became a source of debt, external dependence, and loss of economic maneuverability. So 90% of all exported gold went directly to finance the deficit with England and France. The country was rapidly losing its industrial base. The share of the population employed outside of agriculture decreased from 46.5% in 1750 to 33.1%. 100 years later, cities also began to empty out. The level of urbanization did not increase, but instead rolled back from 17.3 to 16.2 between the years 1750 and 1800. Against this background, Portugal was moving in the opposite direction compared to England at that time, where cities were rapidly growing and becoming centers of the new industrial economy. Despite having similar starting conditions, Portugal did not follow the path of industrialization like England. Both countries had access to the sea, powerful trading fleets, access to colonial markets, capital from foreign trade, and relatively strong state institutions for their time. The difference was not in the availability of resources, but in the way they were used. In England, capital was consistently invested in the production of technology and the growth of productivity. In Portugal, however, the influx of colonial gold removed the need for reforms and entrenched the rent-based model. Wealth did not create incentives to work and invest. Instead, it allowed people to live off control over existing income streams. In modern terms, this was classic rent-seeking, meaning trying to get rich not by creating something new, but by gaining access to already existing wealth. The Portuguese king of that time, John V, spent the gold revenues quite wastefully. Instead of industrialization, these resources were mostly spent on conspicuous consumption, court luxury, and large-scale religious projects. The most famous of these is the Mafra Palace Monastery, which became an architectural symbol of excessive wealth without economic return. John V went down in history as the monarch who squandered the empire's gold. He strengthened royal power, bought political prestige in Europe, financed the Vatican and the clergy, but invested almost nothing in education, science, or industry. With so much revenue, the crown no longer needed parliamentary approval for funding. So it even got to the point where Parliament did not convene throughout the entire 18th century. By 1800, Portugal's GDP per capita was 40% lower than it would have been without the reserves of Brazilian gold. The gold, which brought in a lot of money, turned Portugal from a prosperous nation with a GDP per capita higher than France and Spain into the poorest country in Western Europe by 1850. The country never developed the industrial base or human capital necessary for sustainable growth. Even in the first half of the 18th century, the literacy rate in Portugal was close to that of the most developed countries in Europe. But the situation changed dramatically in the second half of the 18th century. By 1773, less than a third of the existing primary schools had even one teacher. By 1800, the level of Portuguese literacy, measured by the percentage of adults who could write their own name, lagged significantly behind other Western European countries. The 19th century turned out to be even more difficult because of the war with Napoleon. In 1807, Napoleon ordered the invasion of Portugal because it refused to join the continental blockade against Britain, Portugal's most important trading partner and political ally. Britain, the most important trading partner and political ally of Portugal. Portuguese military actions devastated agriculture, the foundation of the Portuguese economy. Fields were destroyed, livestock was requisitioned, and peasants were forced to flee or serve in the armies. Between 1820 and 1913, Portuguese GDP per capita fell from 77% to 36% of the Western European level. This was the lowest growth among all countries in the region. Growth rates were either the lowest or below 70%. The Portuguese military devastated the agricultural sector of the Portuguese economy at the time. Other countries were already advancing. Fields were destroyed. Livestock. Peasants had to serve in such a condition. The country was inherited by the Salazar regime after the military coup of 1926. In 16 years, from 1910 to 1926, Portugal went through 45 changes of government. Political parties were constantly fighting each other for power. The economic crisis made any government unpopular within a few months. No government lasted long enough to implement serious economic changes. In 1926, after yet another military coup, the position of Minister of Finance was given to Professor of Economics from Portugal's most prestigious University of Coimbra, Antonio Salazar. He was a talented theorist and actively wrote articles on economic policy. However, just 5 days after his appointment, Salazar resigned. The military did not give him full control over budget expenditures, and he believed that without such authority, it would not be possible to work effectively. By 1928, the national debt was increasing. The country was on the verge of bankruptcy, and the then president of Portugal convinced Salazar to return. But this time, it was on his own terms. So Salazar was given the power to veto any government spending. He implemented radical cuts to government spending while simultaneously raising taxes. He reduced the salaries of civil servants, military officers, and pensioners. He also cut ministry budgets and spending on the colonies. The total amount of these cuts was equivalent to over $120 million by today's standards. In 2 years, Salazar eliminated the budget deficit, returned the country to the gold standard, and began paying off foreign debts. And in 1932, he became prime minister. He cared more about concentrating wealth than about economic institutions. His regime introduced an industrial licensing system that required prior government approval for almost all business activities. The private sector of Portugal belonged to about 40 families who controlled the economy through intertwined ownership. These families owned all the major commercial banks and also held seats on the boards of directors of Portuguese companies. It got to the point where large conglomerates like CUF, specializing in chemicals, cement, and metallurgy, and the Champalimod Group, focused on cement, steel, and mining, dominated the market. And together, those groups had a combined turnover that approached 70% of GDP by 1974. CUF was actually among the 200 largest companies in Europe and was the biggest on the Iberian Peninsula. The corporatist system created a dual economy. Large protected conglomerates and millions of small firms existed side by side. Labor markets were under strict government control over wages and working conditions. It was not possible to relocate or build an industrial facility in the country without government permission. Investments in equipment or increasing the production capacity of existing enterprises also required government approval. Trade unions were banned, and there was no minimum wage policy. At the same time, throughout Western Europe, the legal status of trade unions was formalized and enshrined in law. Despite these structural problems, from 1950 to 1970, the country had an average annual per capita GDP growth of 5.7%. Between 1961 and 1974, GDP grew by 6.9% annually, and industrial production expanded by 9% per year. A key factor in this leap was external integration. The fact is that Portugal joined the Marshall Plan, the U.S. economic aid program for European countries after World War II. It also joined the European Free Trade Association. This organization was an alternative trade bloc for those European countries that could not or did not want to join the then European Economic Community. As a result, the community gave Portugal access to European markets and foreign capital. The share of foreign investment in capital formation increased from less than 6 to 25% in 6 years. Portuguese exports increased by 52% and imports by 40% during the 1960s. The country lived under the rule of Salazar and his successor, Marcelo Caetano, for more than 40 years. The regime relied on censorship and political police, and public discontent was growing. The prolonged colonial wars in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, which consumed about half of the country's budget, caused particular outrage. The driving force behind one of the most unusual and at the same time revealing revolutions in post-war Europe was the Armed Forces Movement, an informal association of junior and mid-level officers. They were outraged by military reforms that undermined the career prospects of professional soldiers. The reforms allowed for the accelerated granting of officer ranks to graduates of civilian universities. Meanwhile, officers with combat experience fought for years in the colonies without promotion. Otelo Saraiva de Carvalho, the leader of the Armed Forces Movement, developed the coup plan, and Salgueiro Maia, one of the main commanders, directly led the troops in Lisbon. On the morning of April 25, 1974, the military seized the capital's television, radio, and ministry buildings. The Portuguese supported the uprising, took to the streets, gave red carnations to the soldiers, and placed them in the barrels of their rifles. In terms of violence, it was an almost bloodless event. However, its consequences were so radical that a regime which had existed for more than 40 years disappeared in a single day. Portugal quickly abandoned its colonial wars, recognized the independence of African territories, and began dismantling the authoritarian system. At the same time, the first years after the revolution were accompanied by political instability, economic upheavals, a wave of nationalizations, and struggles between different ideological camps. After the revolution, power passed to the Armed Forces Movement, which formed a provisional government. There was political struggle between the communists, socialists, and conservative forces. As a result, the Socialist Party member Mário Soares came to power. He led the Socialist Party of Portugal, which received the largest number of votes and seats in parliament, thus gaining the right to form the government. And although the Carnation Revolution ended the dictatorship, it triggered a rapid economic decline due to radical Marxist policies. Between March 1975 and July 1976, 244 private enterprises were nationalized. Almost all Portuguese capital in banking, insurance, petrochemicals, fertilizers, tobacco, cement, and wood pulp went to the state. In 1978, between 15 and 24% of GDP went to the state business sector. Then came major industrial consolidations. 15 banks were reduced to 9, and the 5 largest chemical firms merged into one. The same thing happened with oil and electric power companies. The key assets of the aforementioned largest conglomerate, CUF, were also nationalized. Agricultural collectivization turned out to be just as radical. Until 1974, this sector was dominated by private ownership. After the revolution, however, agrarian reform began. Large estates were taken over and handed over to rural workers, and turned into collective farms or cooperatives. By 1977, 540 collective farms were operating on 1,140,000 hectares. These collectives were overstaffed with personnel unable to modernize agriculture. It became stagnant. The oil refining, chemical, cement, pulp and paper, glass, and some other industries similarly passed into state ownership. As a result, about 12% of Portuguese industrial production was produced by 19 state corporations, most of which had an actual monopoly in their sectors of activity. Inflation averaged 21.4% annually, reaching a peak of almost 30% in 1984. At the same time, financial and human capital were leaving the country en masse. A survey conducted in 1976-1977 revealed that 52 professional managers had emigrated, with larger firms losing more than 50 managers. The situation was further complicated by more than 500,000 Portuguese refugees who returned from the newly independent African colonies. The amount of budget subsidies allocated for these refugees was estimated at about 11% of total government expenditures. Overall, the increase in the civilian population from 1974 to 1976 reached up to 900,000, 10% of the total population in 1973. The legacy of the revolution included the massive dominance of the state sector and strict labor regulations. Labor legislation after 1974 provided maximum protection for those already employed, but paid little regard to productivity or job creation. Firing employees was complicated, expensive, and legally challenging. As a result, a dual labor market was formed. Those who already had jobs enjoyed almost complete protection, while young people and new workers found themselves on the periphery in temporary employment, with no career prospects and a high level of unemployment, which, after the arrival of refugees, rose from over 2% in 1974 to more than 7.5% in 1997. It was with this model, an inflated role of the state, an inflexible labor market, and limited incentives for private investment, that Portugal entered the European Union. Formally, the country integrated into the common market, but internal institutional constraints seriously limited its ability to take advantage of these opportunities. Joining the European Union in 1986 gave Portugal access not only to the common market, but also to constant financial support from the Union. Over the next 35 years, the country received about 160 billion euros in European transfers. These were mainly grants for infrastructure, regional development, education, agriculture, and economic modernization. To get a sense of the scale, this amount is roughly equal to half of Portugal's entire GDP today. And if you break it down over time, it turns out that for more than 3 decades, the economy received an additional 2.5% of GDP every year. In many countries, such a boost is already considered a strong stimulus for growth in itself. But the paradox is that the rate of economic growth after joining the EU was cut in half despite the unprecedented assistance. European integration did not automatically speed up Portugal's development. Before joining the EU, the country was growing faster, although compared to other countries, the pace was still modest. During the pre-war and later authoritarian decades, as well as during the period of economic opening, the average GDP growth remained at about 3.9%. This was a stage of catch-up development, industrialization, urbanization, inflow of investments, and expansion of production. After joining the EU, the trajectory changed. Already at the beginning of the 1990s, the average growth rates fell by almost half, to about 1.7%. In the second half of the decade, the economy briefly rebounded. It picked up and reached 2.8%. But this momentum quickly ran out. In the early 2000s, the country entered a period often referred to as the lost decade. Growth hovered around zero and on average did not even reach 1%. In 2007, The Economist called Portugal the new sick man of Europe. Portugal's economic slowdown was the result of a catastrophic failure in total factor productivity, an indicator of how efficiently resources are used to produce goods or services. The more output produced with the same or fewer inputs, the higher the factor productivity. Until 1986, Portuguese companies produced more and more each year with the same amount of resources. After joining the EU, this indicator stopped increasing. It became negative and dropped on average to minus 1.85 annually during the period from 2000 to 2007. The worst figures were in real estate, minus 4.44 annually in trade, minus 2.96, and in construction, minus 2.46%. By contrast, production fell on average by 0.81 annually. Meanwhile, in the rest of the Eurozone, it was growing by 0.92 annually. Moreover, labor productivity, that is, how many goods or services one worker produces in a certain period of time, is 35% lower than the EU average. The same is true, by the way, for Bulgaria and Greece. Portugal also ranks 14th out of 19 Eurozone countries in terms of capital per worker as of 2021. That is, how well equipped, so to speak, the average worker is to do their job. It turns out that a Portuguese worker has significantly less modern equipment, technology, or infrastructure at their disposal compared to colleagues in Germany, France, or Spain. Even now, the business sector in Portugal is dominated by unproductive micro-enterprises. 96% of companies have fewer than 10 employees, while only 0.1% are large firms with more than 250 employees. The unproductiveness of small firms is evident from the fact that half of them have existed for more than 10 years but remain small businesses. This points to fundamental barriers to growth. The main problem was that the money from the European Union mostly went toward consumption. After joining, government spending reached almost half of the country's entire economy. In 2010, government spending reached a historic high of almost 52% of GDP. The lion's share of these funds went to pensions and social benefits, as well as to the salaries of the bloated state apparatus. Social spending consumed about 20% of GDP, of which pensions alone accounted for 9.6% of GDP. Salaries for civil servants cost more than 12% of GDP. The rest was distributed among healthcare at 10%, education at about 5%, and servicing the national debt at 3% of GDP. At the same time, the tax burden increased sharply. At the beginning of the 2000s, it was about 31% of GDP. The main burden fell on VAT and personal income tax. By 2018, if you take into account the full tax burden along with social contributions, it had already risen to 34.9% of GDP. By 2022, the figure increased even further to 36.4% of GDP. In fact, the state began to expand faster than the economy itself. Over several decades, taxes increased, taking an ever larger share of income from citizens and businesses. At the same time, these resources were mainly directed not at stimulating productivity, but at maintaining a bloated state apparatus, social payments, and officials' salaries. The number of civil servants kept increasing. If in 1988, the state had 475,368 officials, by 2005, their number had reached 747,880 people. This is an increase of 54% compared to 1988. In 2005, the number of civil servants per 1,000 inhabitants in Portugal was higher than the average in the European Union. Total investment fell from 35% of GDP in 1974 to just 19% in 2020. The money was coming in, but it was spent on consumption rather than creating productive capacity. But that's not all. Between 2010 and 2014, 41% of Portuguese firms paid more in interest on loans than they generated in cash flow. That means almost half of the businesses were operating at a loss. surviving only thanks to new loans. At the same time, 20% of companies paid more in interest than they earned every year. It turns out that a fifth of the economy has turned into a sort of dead zone, which exists by absorbing capital without giving anything back. This happened because Portuguese banks were undercapitalized after the 2010 crisis and hid losses from bad loans. Instead of stopping the financing of unprofitable companies, the banks continued to give them new loans so they could pay interest on their old debts. This allowed them to avoid recognizing losses and maintain the illusion of a healthy balance sheet. Regulators effectively allowed this practice, fearing that mass bankruptcies would lead to even greater economic problems. If you look at other countries in a similar situation, for example, distant and cold Ireland, it also received similar transfers from the EU. 3% of GNP annually from 1989 to 1999. But now the country is one of the richest members of the EU. Both countries joined the EU as peripheral agrarian economies with similar income levels. Ireland's strategy focuses on creating favorable conditions for foreign direct investment. To encourage foreign companies to come to the country, Ireland gradually reduced the corporate tax rate from 50 to 12.5 in 2003. Portugal took the opposite approach. Instead of tax incentives for businesses, the country sharply increased government spending. This left significantly fewer resources for attracting private capital. In addition, Ireland invested heavily in universities, preparing English-speaking specialists for technology companies. In 1975, the average Irish person studied for 8.9 years. In the same year, the average Portuguese person studied for a little over 4 years. The country couldn't catch up with Ireland in education until 1995. As a result, after joining the EU, Ireland turned into Europe's technology hub with a highly productive economy, while Portugal fell into the lost decade of the 2000s, with the lowest growth rates on the continent. Portugal has a structural dependence on tourism. Its active development began back in the 2000s, and over time, the industry grew to critical proportions. Today, tourism generates more than 21.5% of GDP. Similarly, just as oil has become the dominant source of income for some Middle Eastern countries, for Portugal, tourism is now like oil production is for a country like Qatar. The sector supports 1,200,000 jobs, almost 23% of total employment. Although the large number of tourists generates significant income, it is short-term and slowly stifles the country's economic growth. Even the Minister of Finance of Portugal admitted in November 2024, that the country needs to reduce the importance of tourism. He argued that the only way to grow is through innovation, services, and high technology. Tourism has triggered an unprecedented housing affordability crisis. First of all, short-term rentals through platforms like Airbnb have massively removed housing from the long-term market. Owners realize that renting to tourists for a week is more profitable than renting to locals for a year. The number of Airbnb listings in Lisbon increased sharply after 2014. In 2018, there were 15,700 active listings, while in 2014, there were only 2,000. This sharply reduced the supply of housing for long-term residents. Secondly, the Golden Visa program allowed foreigners to obtain residency by investing in real estate, which led to a massive influx of buyers from abroad, especially in the expensive long-term segment. From 2012 to 2023, foreigners invested 6.48 billion euros in Portuguese real estate through the Golden Visa program, which accounted for over 90% of all investments under the program. Foreigners were buying up apartments in Lisbon and Porto, artificially inflating prices. Thirdly, the construction of new housing was catastrophically lagging behind demand. For every 10 apartments sold, only one new one was built between 2018 and 2022. The main reason was regulatory inefficiency. Delays in issuing construction permits reach up to 3 years, which, together with complicated zoning rules and historical preservation requirements, prevents an increase in housing supply. And then everything follows the classic principle: when demand rises and supply falls, prices go up. The cost of housing more than doubled between 2015 and 2024. The median cost per square meter jumped from 763.00 EUR in July 2014 to 1,736.00 EUR in October 2024. The cost increased by 127%. Rental prices rose even more, by 20.5% in just 2023. This is the highest growth rate since 1994. So, rent has increased by almost a quarter, while salaries are growing by only a few percent per year on average. For ordinary Portuguese people, housing has simply become unaffordable. Young families can't buy or rent. They're forced to live with their parents or emigrate. Housing now costs almost 12 times more than a household's annual income. In Lisbon, it reaches 19 times a household's annual income, making it less affordable than in San Francisco or London. Now Portugal has the worst housing affordability among all the countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Monthly mortgage payments require 133 monthly salaries in Lisbon and over 50 in all major cities. On top of all the economic constraints, there's another long-term pressure factor: demographics. In 2023, there were 85,699 births registered in Portugal, compared to 118,295 deaths. The natural population growth turned negative back in 2009 and has not recovered since. Within the EU, only Italy, Spain, and Greece have worse figures. The situation is further complicated by the fact that the average age at which women have their first child has risen to 31.6 years, narrowing the demographic window. At the same time, the country is losing its youth due to large-scale immigration. About 30% of Portuguese people aged 15 to 39 live abroad permanently, and the total diaspora, it exceeds 2.3 million people. Since the early 2000s, more than 75,000 people have left the country every year on average. And the peak was in 2013, when about 120,000 people emigrated. The return rate is minimal. From 2011 to 2021, only 1 in 7 came back, while 61% of emigrants do not plan to return at all. Despite the labor shortage, youth unemployment remains high. Among the age group 16 to 24, it ranges from 19.5 to 21.5%, which is about 7.3 percentage points higher than the average in the European Union. Altogether, this creates a demographic trap. The country is aging, young people are leaving, and the domestic labor market is stagnant, becomes attractive enough to reverse this trend. All this is due to strict employment protection and over-regulated labor laws. The Portuguese labor code is one of the strictest in the developed world. This can be measured by the World Bank's Rigidity of Employment Index, which shows how difficult it is for companies to hire and fire employees. The index is calculated as the average of 3 components: the difficulty of hiring new employees, the rigidity of working hours regulation, and the difficulty of dismissal. In 2008, Portugal scored 43 out of a possible 100 points. This is almost twice as high as the average score for OECD countries, which was 26 points. An employer could only dismiss an employee after a written notice with a detailed justification. And granting the employee the right to a written response and to gather evidence. The notice periods ranged from 15 to 75 days. Severance payments were also quite substantial. Until November 2011, the employee received a full monthly salary for each year of service. For 20 years of service, this meant 20 months of salary. As a result, companies did not plan accordingly. Companies could easily hire or fire employees, so they relied on temporary contracts. And Portuguese salaries remain far below European standards, making emigration economically rational. The average annual salary before taxes is over 24,800 euros compared to the EU average of 41,000 euros. Mostly, lower salaries are found in former communist countries that joined the EU after 2004. Moreover, Portugal's national debt remains quite high. The debt-to-GDP ratio is 89.7 as of 2025, down from 96.9 in 2023. But that's still close to a crisis level. For comparison, the average debt level in the EU is 80.7 at the end of 2024, which is lower than Portugal's figure. Among the southern European countries, Greece, Italy, and Spain have worse figures. The overall picture with demographics looks alarming. With a fertility rate of 1.44, the population share is 65%. Plus, with years at the level of 21 to 24 and youth emigration around 30, the system is gradually losing balance. There are not enough workers to support the growing number of pensioners. Aging is also accelerating statistically. The median age increased from 33.9 years in 1990 to 44.8 years in 2019-2020. This is no longer a demographic trend, but a structural shift. With this set of problems, dependence on transfers and tourism, and demographic contraction, sustainable economic success would seem almost impossible. And yet it happened. In December 2025, The Economist named Portugal the best economy of the year among 36 developed countries. GDP grew by 2.4%, inflation remained low, and the stock market gained over 20%. After decades of slow growth and stagnation, this sounds almost like an economic miracle. The paradox is that this result appeared not in spite of the problems, but in their shadow. The main reason is that Portugal has maintained a budget surplus at around 1% of GDP for the third year in a row. In almost 50 years of democratic history, this has happened only for the second time. The country has finally managed to rein in its uncontrolled spending. In addition, the EU has allocated new subsidies to Portugal. But unlike previous rounds, this time the money is not going toward ordinary consumption. They are being directed toward infrastructure, the development of digital technologies, and improving the skills of the workforce. In other words, exactly what the country has been lacking for decades. The history of Portugal shows that resources alone do not guarantee prosperity. What really matters is how they are used. The country, you see, was receiving massive inflows. First, Brazilian gold, then billions in transfers from the EU. And both times it spent them on consumption instead of investing in development. However, the main challenge remains solving the demographic crisis, and it is directly linked to the productivity of the economy. As long as Portuguese companies produce a third less than the average European worker, wages will remain low, and young people will continue to leave. The solution is not in subsidies or social programs. It's in creating conditions for highly productive businesses. This means reducing bureaucratic barriers to investment, simplifying labor legislation, and making large-scale investments in technical education. The housing crisis, which makes having children economically irrational, also calls not for price controls, but for deregulating construction and at least partially lifting building restrictions. This problem has a direct parallel with Ukraine. We have a similar demographic structure, low birth rates, an aging population, and mass emigration. In the last 10 years, the birth rate in Ukraine has decreased by 2 times. In the first half of 2025, there were 86,795 births and 249,002 deaths recorded. That means there are almost 3 deaths for every newborn now. Everything is further complicated by the fact that over the past 20 years, the median age in Ukraine has increased from 37.7 to 41.8 years. This means that half of Ukraine's population is younger than this age, and half is older. Moreover, according to the National Bank of Ukraine, as of the end of 2025, the number of Ukrainians abroad reaches 25 million, of which 7.5 million left after the start of the full-scale war. But even before the war, Ukraine's population was decreasing by more than 300,000 people annually on average. Such a demographic situation may lead to problems with Ukraine's pension system, which directly depends on the number of young people in the labor market. And for it to be financially stable, the number of young people must be significantly higher than the number of pensioners. The demographic crisis is also directly related to the reduction of the workforce. According to the European Business Association, 95% of Ukrainian businesses are already experiencing a shortage of personnel, and 74% of them have recognized this as a significant problem. And while Portugal lost part of its population due to uncompetitive wages during peacetime, Ukraine risks losing even more after the war if it does not create conditions for a productive economy. The Portuguese experience shows that neither EU subsidies nor social programs stop emigration. Only competitive wages can stop it, and they appear only in a highly productive economy. Write in the comments what you think. Will Portugal be able to change its trajectory? Or is it just well-disguised temporary luck against the backdrop of deep structural problems? This video was
made possible with support from Atlas Network. The opinions of the authors of the video do not necessarily reflect those of Atlas Network.
Friends, we have an ambitious goal to reach 200,000 subscribers on the channel by the end of 2026. You might have been watching us for a long time and not even realize that you haven't subscribed. Subscribe to our channel and tell your relatives and friends about it. Also, give us a like and leave a comment under this video. We thank all our donors, patrons, and sponsors on YouTube. Every contribution you make brings Ukraine closer to economic prosperity and well-being. After all, we are not just making videos, we are educating voters who will choose real reformers. Help us with this. The link to support the price of the state is in the description.